What if I told you that the Russian Revolution was not as spontaneous as history books claim? That behind the protests, the strikes, and the calls for a new government, there were carefully laid plans, secret negotiations, and unexpected alliances shaping the course of history long before the first shot was fired? Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 is often depicted as the moment that changed everything. But few realize that his journey home was not merely a return from exile. It was a calculated operation backed by an unlikely benefactor. The German Empire, locked in a brutal war against Russia on the Eastern Front, saw in Lenin an opportunity, a chance to weaken their enemy from within. With German financial assistance and a sealed train that transported him across enemy lines, Lenin arrived in Petrograd with a mission, one that would not just overthrow a government, but lay the groundwork for a radical new order. Yet Lenin's ambitions stretched far beyond Russia's borders. He was not just a revolutionary, but a strategist who understood that control required more than fiery speeches and mass protests. He had a plan, one that would manipulate existing turmoil, exploit divisions, and ensure that power remained firmly in Bolshevik hands. Today, we uncover Lenin's secret plans, the hidden forces that aided him, and the true story of the Bolshevik uprising. What was carefully orchestrated? Who stood to benefit? And what did Lenin really intend for Russia's future? The answers may challenge everything you thought you knew about the Russian Revolution. In the early 20th century, Russia stood at a crossroads, a vast empire spanning 2 continents ruled by a monarch whose grip on power was slipping. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, sat atop a crumbling system, one that had endured for centuries but was now straining under the weight of internal unrest, economic hardship, and a costly war. For generations, the Russian Empire had been a land of stark contrasts. The aristocracy and ruling elite lived in opulence, while the majority, peasants and industrial workers, struggled under poverty and harsh conditions. Serfdom had been abolished only a few decades earlier, but many former serfs remained tied to the land through crushing debts. In the cities, rapid industrialization created a new working class, but their wages remained low, their living conditions dire, and their patience thin. Nicholas II, a ruler deeply committed to autocracy, believed in his divine right to govern. But he was ill-prepared for the scale of discontent that was growing around him. Strikes and protests had become more frequent, especially after the disastrous events of 1905, when a peaceful workers' march in St. Petersburg ended in bloodshed, an event remembered as Bloody Sunday. The massacre shattered the myth of the Tsar as a benevolent father to his people, and sowed the first seeds of revolution. By 1914, when Russia entered the First World War, the empire was already struggling. The war effort placed immense strain on an economy that was not equipped for a prolonged conflict. Millions of Russian soldiers were sent to the front, ill-equipped and poorly trained. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate, and defeats on the battlefield further eroded confidence in the government. Food shortages became widespread, inflation soared, and the once loyal peasantry began to question why they were suffering for a war they did not understand. Back in Petrograd, anger was reaching a boiling point. The Tsar's decisions, often influenced by his wife, Empress Alexandra, and her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin, alienated many within the government and military leadership. Corruption was rampant, and the disconnect between the ruling elite and the masses had never been more glaring. Early 1917 saw strikes paralyze factories, soldiers desert in droves, and bread riots sweep through the streets. It was clear that the system could not hold much longer. Nicholas II, isolated and increasingly detached from reality, failed to recognize the gravity of the situation. The empire was teetering, and all it needed was a final push. The February Revolution would provide that push. But behind the scenes, another force was waiting. One with a vision of revolution far more radical than the one that would remove the Tsar. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were watching, preparing, and ready to seize the moment. Factory workers were the first to move. Strikes erupted across the city, grinding production to a halt. The government tried to keep control, but the usual threats of force no longer carried weight. Soldiers, men who had once been loyal to the Tsar, were no longer willing to fire on their own people. Some hesitated, others refused outright. And in the most shocking sign that things had changed, entire regiments abandoned their posts and joined the protesters. At first, the unrest looked like yet another wave of discontent, the kind the government had put down before. But this time was different. The war had drained Russia of its resources, its will, and its belief in its rulers. The Tsar was absent, as he often was, directing military campaigns from afar while his people suffered at home. His ministers, corrupt and divided, had no plan to contain the chaos. The turning point came in late February, early March by the modern calendar, when thousands of women took to the streets on International Women's Day, protesting not only for bread but for their dignity. The march swelled into a mass demonstration, drawing in workers, students, and eventually soldiers. The city that had once been the heart of imperial power was now in the hands of the people. Within days, it was clear the old order had collapsed. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 3 centuries, was finished, but what came next would be even more uncertain. As power slipped from the Tsar's hands, new factions rushed to seize control. Some wanted a democratic government, others wanted a socialist state, and watching from exile, a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin saw his moment approaching. In the chaos of 1917, 4 men stood at the center of Russia's fate, each with a vision for the country's future and each willing to fight for it. Tsar Nicholas II had ruled Russia for over 2 decades. To his supporters, he was the rightful emperor chosen by God to lead. But to his critics, he was a weak and indecisive ruler, blind to the suffering of his people. He clung to the belief that absolute monarchy could still work in the modern world, ignoring the warnings of advisors and the growing unrest in the streets. Even as protests turned into a full-scale revolution, Nicholas hesitated. When he finally acted, it was too late. His own generals abandoned him, and by March 1917 he was forced to abdicate. The first Russian Tsar to do so in over 300 years. With the monarchy gone, the question remained: who would take control? One man who saw himself as the answer was Alexander Kerensky. A skilled orator and a rising figure in the provisional government, Kerensky believed in democracy and reform. He wanted to guide Russia toward a constitutional system, balancing socialist ideals with a functioning government. At first, he gained public support. He freed political prisoners, promised land reform, and tried to keep order. But Kerensky faced an impossible challenge. He kept Russia in the war, hoping for victory, but the people wanted peace. He spoke of compromise, but radical factions saw him as weak. His government had power on paper, but in the streets, control was slipping away. Waiting for his moment was Leon Trotsky, an intellectual and strategist who understood revolution better than anyone. Charismatic and fiercely intelligent, Trotsky was a master of organizing workers and soldiers. He had spent years in exile, sharpening his ideas and building connections. When the revolution erupted, he returned to Russia, quickly rising to leadership in the Petrograd Soviet. He knew that real power did not belong to politicians in government offices. It belonged to those who controlled the streets, the factories, and the armed forces. Trotsky's speeches could electrify a crowd, but his true genius was in planning. He was already setting the stage for what would come next. And then there was Vladimir Lenin. Unlike the others, Lenin was not in Russia when the February Revolution unfolded. He was watching from afar, in Switzerland, calculating his next move. He had spent years preparing for revolution, convinced that only a vanguard of dedicated revolutionaries could overthrow the system and establish a socialist state. When Nicholas abdicated, Lenin saw an opportunity, but he needed a way to return. What few knew at the time was that Lenin's journey back to Russia would be arranged with the help of an unlikely source. As these four men moved through history, one losing his throne, one struggling to hold a fragile government together, and two preparing for a second revolution, the fate of Russia hung in the balance. The February Revolution had ended the Romanov dynasty, but the real battle for Russia's future had only begun. And soon, Lenin would arrive to tip the scales. For years, Vladimir Lenin had been a man without a country. Exiled from Russia, he had spent decades moving from one European city to another, London, Paris, Krakow, always watching, always writing, always planning. But by 1917, he was in Zurich, Switzerland, a small apartment serving as his headquarters. From there, Lenin followed every development in Russia with obsessive detail. He read newspapers, analyzed political reports, and exchanged letters with fellow revolutionaries across Europe. To him, the February Revolution was not the victory so many believed it to be. The Tsar was gone, yes, but the provisional government was, in his eyes, just another obstacle to true revolution. Lenin did not want a compromise between democracy and socialism. He wanted the complete destruction of the old system and the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat. But he had a problem. He was thousands of miles away, with no way to return. Travel across war-torn Europe was nearly impossible. The Western Front was a battlefield. The Eastern Front was controlled by forces loyal to the Russian war effort. And his enemies, both monarchists and moderate socialists, would arrest him the moment he set foot in Russia. Then came an opportunity no one could have predicted. A shocking offer from Imperial Germany. To Germany, Lenin was not just a revolutionary, he was a potential weapon. The German Empire had been locked in a brutal war with Russia since 1914, and despite early successes, the Russian army remained a formidable force. Every day the war continued, German soldiers died on the Eastern Front. The German High Command wanted Russia out of the war, and Lenin, with his fierce anti-war stance, presented a solution. If Lenin and his Bolsheviks could destabilize Russia further, perhaps even seize power, then Germany would have one less enemy to fight. It was a gamble, but one that the German General Staff, including figures like Arthur Zimmermann and Richard von Kuhlmann, believed was worth taking. Through secret negotiations, the Germans agreed to provide Lenin with a way back to Russia. They would transport him and his most loyal associates across enemy territory on one condition. Once in power, Lenin was to push for Russia's immediate withdrawal from the war. This arrangement was not without risks. If exposed, it could discredit Lenin as a German agent. Even among revolutionaries, taking help from a foreign power was dangerous. But Lenin was pragmatic. He saw the German offer not as a betrayal of the revolution, but as a necessary step toward its success. He accepted, and so the plan was set in motion. On April 9, 1917, Lenin and a group of 31 Bolsheviks boarded a specially arranged train in Zurich. To maintain secrecy, the Germans ensured that the train was sealed. Once Lenin and his entourage were inside, no one could enter or leave. German soldiers stood guard at the doors, and Lenin was not allowed to speak with anyone outside his group. This was not just about security. The sealed train was also a political shield. By keeping Lenin isolated, the Germans could later claim that he had no contact with their officials and that he had traveled as an independent actor. In reality, German intermediaries coordinated every step of the journey. The train traveled north through Germany, passing through Berlin under heavy supervision. From there, it continued to the Baltic coast, where the passengers were ferried to Sweden. By the time Lenin reached neutral territory, the Bolshevik leader was no longer just an exile. He was a man on a mission heading straight for the heart of the revolution. Finally, on April 16, 1917, Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station. What awaited him was chaos, soldiers, workers, and revolutionaries cheering his return. Lenin wasted no time. That very night, he delivered a speech laying out his vision. No support for the provisional government, no continuation of the war, and full power to the Soviets. His words sent shockwaves through the political establishment. The moderate socialists in the provisional government, including Alexander Kerensky, had hoped to stabilize Russia. Lenin had no such intention. He was not returning to join the system. He was coming to destroy it. And as the months unfolded, it became clear Lenin's arrival was just the beginning. His plans for Russia were ruthless. On April 17th, Lenin presented his April Theses to the Bolsheviks. The document was short, only 10 points, but its implications were monumental. No support for the provisional government. Lenin declared that the government was nothing more than a bourgeois dictatorship, serving the interests of capitalists and imperialists. While moderate socialists believed in working alongside it, Lenin saw it as an obstacle that had to be removed. Immediate withdrawal from the war. Lenin called for Russia to unilaterally exit World War I. He argued that the conflict was a war of imperialists fought for the benefit of the ruling class at the expense of workers and peasants. While the provisional government insisted on continuing the war, Lenin made ending it his top priority. Land to the peasants. Russia's vast rural population had long suffered under the control of wealthy landowners. Lenin promised that the Bolsheviks would confiscate land from the aristocracy and redistribute it to those who worked it. Power to the Soviets. The Soviets, grassroots councils of workers and soldiers, had emerged as a powerful force in revolutionary Russia. While the provisional government claimed authority over the country, Lenin argued that real power should belong to these councils. Nationalization of industry. Lenin demanded the complete transfer of banks, factories, and major industries to state control. The economy, he argued, should be placed in the hands of workers rather than private capitalists. These ideas were revolutionary, even by socialist standards. Many Bolsheviks were shocked. Some feared that Lenin's approach was too extreme, that pushing for immediate revolution would alienate moderates and provoke a crackdown. But Lenin was not interested in moderation. He was laying the foundation for a second revolution, one that would sweep away not just the monarchy, but the entire political structure of Russia. To make his vision a reality, Lenin needed to turn the people against the provisional government. But the government, led by Alexander Kerensky and other moderate socialists, still had support among the army intellectuals and many workers. Lenin's challenge was to break that support slowly, methodically, and ruthlessly. His strategy was built on three key tactics: exploiting war fatigue. Russia's continued involvement in World War I was deeply unpopular. Soldiers at the front were dying by the thousands, and those in the cities faced food shortages and economic collapse. Lenin used this anger to fuel his argument. The provisional government was refusing to end the war, while the Bolsheviks promised immediate peace, turning the Soviets against the government. At first, the Soviets worked alongside the provisional government, but Lenin urged them to break away. He and the Bolsheviks infiltrated the Soviets, gaining influence and gradually shifting them toward radical action. Undermining moderate socialists, the provisional government was filled with socialist leaders who believed in gradual reform. Lenin painted them as traitors, men who claimed to represent the people but refused to take bold action. He accused them of being controlled by capitalists and failing to address Russia's real problems. Lenin's messaging was relentless. His speeches, writings, and party directives hammered the same points over and over. The provisional government is weak. They serve the rich. They refuse to end the war. Only the Bolsheviks can bring real change. This propaganda campaign began shifting public opinion. More soldiers deserted. More workers turned to Bolshevik ideas. By the summer of 1917, Lenin's movement was growing fast, and the government's control was slipping. To rally the working class and peasantry behind him, Lenin needed a message that was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. So he crafted one of the most famous slogans in revolutionary history: peace, land, and bread. Each word targeted a specific grievance. Peace for the soldiers and their families who were tired of a war they no longer believed in. Land for the peasants who had been promised reforms but saw no real change. Bread for the workers who face food shortages and starvation in the cities. This slogan was brilliant in its simplicity. It cut through political theory and addressed the immediate needs of ordinary people. Whether a soldier in the trenches, a farmer in the countryside, or a factory worker in Petrograd, Lenin's message spoke directly to their suffering. The more the government failed to deliver on these promises, the stronger Lenin's position became. Every missed food shipment, every battlefield defeat, and every broken political promise played into his hands. But Lenin's true ambitions went far beyond slogans. His vision for Russia was not just about reforms, it was about total control. He was not content with gaining influence in the Soviets or pressuring the government for change. He wanted to dismantle the entire political order. And to do that, he would soon make his most decisive move yet. The provisional government was already unstable, but Lenin was preparing to strike the final blow. The July days, the Kornilov affair, and finally the October Revolution, each step would bring him closer to absolute power. The question now was, how far was he willing to go to seize it? In the autumn of 1917, Russia was spiraling deeper into crisis. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was barely holding on to power. Food shortages plagued the cities. Soldiers, exhausted by years of war, deserted the front in massive numbers. Strikes and protests became daily occurrences. The Soviets' worker and soldier councils were growing more radical. To many, it seemed inevitable that change was coming. But what form that change would take remained uncertain. Would Russia transition into a socialist democracy with different leftist factions sharing power? Would the provisional government survive long enough to hold elections? Or would the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, seize control by force? For Lenin, the answer was clear. He had no intention of waiting for history to unfold. He would make history himself. But was the October Revolution truly a popular uprising, as Soviet propaganda later claimed? Or was it a carefully orchestrated coup executed by a disciplined group of revolutionaries who seized power while most of the country remained unaware? In the early hours of October 25, 1917, November 7th, New Style Calendar, the Bolsheviks made their move. It happened swiftly and with minimal bloodshed, a stark contrast to the chaotic street battles of the February Revolution. While Soviet historians later portrayed it as a spontaneous uprising of the working class, the reality was far different. This was no spontaneous act of the people. It was a highly organized operation, planned down to the smallest detail. Lenin had been preparing for this moment for months, carefully choosing the right time to strike. In the days leading up to October 25th, Bolshevik propaganda flooded Petrograd. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches called for the overthrow of the provisional government. But the actual mechanics of the revolution, who would seize which buildings when key infrastructure would be taken, how government forces would be neutralized, were meticulously planned by Trotsky and the Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC. The Bolsheviks did not rely on mass uprisings. They relied on precision. The Bolsheviks had one key advantage that other leftist factions lacked: control over armed militias. These militias, known as the Red Guards, were made up of factory workers and soldiers who had sided with the Bolsheviks. They were well-armed, disciplined, and most importantly loyal to Lenin's cause. Under Trotsky's direction, the Red Guards moved quickly. Their first target was Petrograd's key infrastructure. Telegraph and telephone exchanges were seized, cutting off government communication. Bridges and railways were taken over, ensuring that provisional government forces could not bring in reinforcements. The state bank was occupied, preventing the government from accessing funds. The power station was taken, ensuring Bolshevik control over the city's electricity. One by one, government buildings fell into Bolshevik hands. By mid-morning on October 26th, almost all strategic locations in Petrograd were under their control. Meanwhile, at the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was headquartered, Kerensky scrambled to mount a defense. But most of the government's troops had either deserted or refused to fight. The few remaining soldiers were no match for the Red Guards, and by nightfall, the palace was surrounded. Inside, members of the provisional government debated their fate. Some wanted to flee, others insisted they should stand their ground. But with no reinforcements coming, it was only a matter of time before the Bolsheviks stormed the building. At 10 p.m., a signal was given, the firing of a blank round from the cruiser Aurora, a battleship loyal to the Bolsheviks. Soon after, Red Guards and revolutionary sailors charged into the Winter Palace. Resistance was minimal. The provisional government was arrested. The Bolsheviks had taken power. But while Lenin would later claim that the revolution was the will of the people, the truth was more complex. There were no mass uprisings in the streets. There were no large-scale worker demonstrations demanding Bolshevik rule. Most of Petrograd's citizens went to bed that night unaware that a new government had taken power. The October Revolution had not been a spontaneous act of the people. It had been a military operation executed with speed and precision. If Lenin was the ideological architect of the Bolshevik Revolution, Leon Trotsky was its military mastermind. Trotsky's role in 1917 cannot be overstated. As head of the Military Revolutionary Committee, he was responsible for planning the entire operation. He coordinated the Red Guards' organized troop movements and ensured that key targets were secured without unnecessary bloodshed. Trotsky understood that a chaotic uprising could lead to failure. Instead, he treated the takeover like a military campaign, one that relied on surprise, speed, and precision. His strategy paid off. Historians have often debated how much credit Lenin truly deserves for the success of the October Revolution. While Lenin provided the ideological framework and the vision, it was Trotsky who turned that vision into reality. Without Trotsky's meticulous planning and leadership, the coup could have easily collapsed into disorder. The provisional government, despite its weaknesses, might have been able to rally forces against the Bolsheviks. But with Trotsky's strategic direction, the takeover was swift and decisive. With the provisional government overthrown, Lenin and the Bolsheviks now controlled Petrograd. But their grip on power was far from secure. They had taken the capital, but Russia was a vast and fractured country. In Moscow, fighting between Bolshevik forces and anti-Bolshevik troops raged in the streets for days. Across the countryside, Local Soviets had yet to decide whether they would recognize Lenin's government. And the Bolsheviks were still a minority party. Many socialist factions opposed them. The real challenge was just beginning. Lenin had promised peace, land, and bread. Now he had to deliver. But, as Russia would soon learn, Lenin's vision for the country would come at a cost, one measured in blood, repression, and civil war. And his next move would be even more shocking. What followed was a campaign of suppression, violence, and terror that reshaped Russia and set the stage for one of the most repressive regimes of the 20th century. From the moment the Bolsheviks seized power, they faced opposition from all sides. Rival socialist factions like the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries (SRs), who had initially supported the overthrow of the provisional government, soon realized that Lenin had no intention of sharing power. The Constituent Assembly, a democratic body elected in November 1917, was meant to decide Russia's future. But when the results came in, they were a disaster for the Bolsheviks. The Socialist Revolutionaries won the majority of seats, while Lenin's Bolsheviks received less than a quarter of the vote. For Lenin, the solution was simple. If democracy did not serve the revolution, democracy would be abolished. On January 6, 1918, when the newly elected Constituent Assembly gathered for its first session, Bolshevik forces shut it down at gunpoint. There would be no debate, no negotiation, no political opposition. The Bolsheviks declared that all power would remain in the hands of the Soviets, controlled, of course, by Lenin and his closest allies. This was the first clear signal that the Bolsheviks were not merely a socialist party. They were an authoritarian force willing to use violence to secure absolute control. And Lenin was just getting started. To crush opposition, Lenin needed more than just revolutionary rhetoric. He needed an organization that could root out and destroy his enemies. On December 20th, 1917, just weeks after the October Revolution, Lenin created the Chaika, the Bolshevik secret police. Under the leadership of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Chaika became the most feared institution in Soviet Russia. Its purpose was clear: eliminate counter-revolutionaries. But Lenin's definition of counter-revolutionary was broad. At first, it meant officers of the old Tsarist regime and those who still supported the provisional government. But soon, it included anyone who opposed Bolshevik rule, intellectuals, rival socialists, religious leaders, and even workers who demanded better conditions. The Chaika operated outside of any legal system. It could arrest, imprison, and execute without trial. The bodies of suspected enemies were dumped into mass graves. By mid-1918, thousands of people had disappeared into Chaika dungeons, never to be seen again. This was the beginning of the Red Terror, a campaign of repression that would intensify in the coming years. And at the center of it all was Lenin issuing secret orders, approving executions, and laying the groundwork for the police state that would define Soviet rule for decades. Perhaps the most infamous act of Bolshevik brutality came in July 1918, when the last remnants of Russia's imperial past were erased. By this time, Russia was in the throes of civil war. The Bolsheviks were fighting a growing coalition of white army forces, an alliance of monarchists, anti-Bolshevik socialists, and former Tsarist officers who sought to overthrow Lenin's government. The white forces were gaining strength, and Lenin feared that if they captured Tsar Nicholas II, he could become a rallying symbol for their cause. Since the February Revolution, Nicholas and his family had been under house arrest, first in Petrograd and later in the remote town of Tobolsk, Siberia. In April 1918, they were moved again, this time to the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg deep in the Ural Mountains. What happened next remains one of the darkest moments in Russian history. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, the Bolsheviks made their decision. Lenin himself may not have issued the direct order. Historical records remain ambiguous, but the message from Moscow was clear. The Romanovs must not be allowed to live. At around 2 a.m., Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and a few loyal servants were led into a basement under the pretense of being moved to a safer location. Then, without warning, a group of Bolshevik executioners entered the room and opened fire. The execution was chaotic and brutal. Bullets ricocheted off the children's clothes. Unbeknownst to their executioners, they had sewn jewels into their garments, which acted as makeshift armor. The assassins resorted to bayonets and gunshots at point-blank range. By the end, the entire Romanov family lay dead. Their bodies were doused in acid, burned, and buried in a secret location to prevent their graves from becoming a symbol for anti-Bolshevik resistance. Was it necessary? For Lenin, the answer was yes. He believed that as long as the Romanovs were alive, Russia's old order could be resurrected. Their execution was not just an act of violence, it was a political statement. The Bolsheviks were not just taking power, they were erasing the past, but the killing of the Tsar and his family sent shockwaves across the world. Even within Russia, many saw it as an act of barbarism. The Bolsheviks had now made it clear there would be no mercy for their enemies. With political opposition crushed, the secret police unleashed, and the Romanovs eliminated, Lenin had cemented his control over Russia. But his vision extended far beyond mere survival. He had promised a workers' state, a new kind of government based on socialism. But in practice, Lenin's rule was anything but democratic. Now he faced his next great challenge, civil war. The Bolsheviks had taken Russia, but could they hold it? Enemies surrounded them on all sides. The country was collapsing into chaos, and Lenin was about to make one of the most controversial economic decisions in Russian history. His next move would not only shape the future of the Soviet Union, it would determine whether the Bolshevik experiment survived at all. Russia was descending into civil war, a brutal conflict that would shape the country's future and test Lenin's leadership like never before. His vision was clear: absolute Bolshevik control at any cost. But standing in his way was a formidable coalition of opponents, both within Russia and from abroad. At its core, it was a battle between 2 primary forces: the Red Army, made up of Bolshevik forces loyal to Lenin; the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, former Tsarist officers, and moderate socialists who opposed Bolshevik rule. But the war was far more chaotic than a simple 2-sided conflict. Russia, already devastated by World War I, fragmented into multiple warring factions, each fighting for its own vision of the country's future. The White Army was not a single unified force, but rather a collection of independent military groups scattered across Russia. Their leaders, including Admiral Alexander Kolchak in Siberia, General Anton Denikin in the south, and General Nikolai Yudenik in the northwest, often had conflicting strategies and little coordination. While they were united by their hatred of Bolshevism, they had no single leader, no clear political ideology, and no real plan beyond defeating Lenin. The Red Army, on the other hand, was highly organized and disciplined. Under Leon Trotsky's command, it became an efficient and ruthless military machine. Trotsky imposed strict discipline, including the use of execution squads for deserters, and transformed the Red Army into a formidable force. By 1919, the Bolsheviks were fighting on multiple fronts, with white forces attacking Petrograd, Moscow, and the Volga region. However, despite initial successes, the White Army suffered from internal divisions, lack of popular support, and strategic failures. The Bolsheviks, in contrast, controlled the heartland of Russia, including its major cities, industrial centers, and railway networks. They also employed brutal tactics to maintain control, including mass executions, forced conscriptions, and the use of the Chaika to crush any internal dissent. In 1920, the Red Army had gained the upper hand. One by one, the White forces collapsed. Kolchak was captured and executed in 1920. Denikin fled to exile. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands had died, not only from combat but from famine, disease, and political repression. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had secured victory. Lenin's rule was now uncontested. The Russian Civil War was not fought in isolation. Western powers, alarmed by Lenin's communist ideology, intervened in an attempt to overthrow the Bolsheviks. The United Kingdom, France, the United States, and Japan all sent troops to Russia, but their motives were not entirely aligned. Some sought to restore the monarchy, while others simply wanted to prevent Germany from exploiting Russian instability in the wake of World War I. The British and French were particularly concerned about Bolshevism spreading to Western Europe. They had already fought alongside Russia during World War I and did not want their former ally to fall into chaos. In 1918, Britain sent troops to Murmansk and Archangel in the north, while the French landed in Odessa. The Americans, meanwhile, deployed soldiers to Siberia to guard supply routes. The Japanese took a more aggressive approach, occupying parts of the Russian Far East with tens of thousands of troops, hoping to expand their influence in the region. Despite their military presence, these interventions were largely ineffective. The Western powers were exhausted from World War I and had little political will to engage in another prolonged conflict. By 1920, most of these foreign forces had withdrawn. Their failure not only ensured Bolshevik survival, but also strengthened Lenin's anti-Western stance. He used their intervention as propaganda, painting the Bolsheviks as the defenders of Russian sovereignty against imperialist aggressors. The lesson was clear. Foreign intervention had only helped unite the Bolsheviks and legitimize their rule in the eyes of many Russians. Lenin never saw the Bolshevik Revolution as an isolated event. From the very beginning, he believed that Russia's revolution would ignite a global movement, one that would overthrow capitalist governments across the world. Lenin established the Communist International Comintern, an organization dedicated to promoting communist revolutions worldwide. Its goal was to spread Leninist ideology and provide financial and strategic support to communist movements in Europe and beyond. At the time, Europe was still reeling from World War I, and socialist uprisings were breaking out in several countries. In Germany, the Spartacist uprising of 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, attempted to establish a communist government, but was brutally crushed by right-wing forces. In Hungary, a Soviet-style republic was briefly established under Béla Kun in 1919 before being overthrown. In Italy, growing socialist movements fueled strikes and protests, leading to fears of a communist revolution. Lenin saw these uprisings as proof that world revolution was imminent. He believed that if communist governments could be established in Germany and elsewhere, they could join forces with Soviet Russia, creating an unstoppable global workers' state. But by 1921, it became clear that revolution was not spreading as Lenin had hoped. Communist uprisings in Europe failed one after another, often due to a lack of organization or brutal government suppression. Instead of a worldwide communist revolution, Lenin was left with a single isolated Soviet state, surrounded by hostile capitalist nations. This forced him to rethink his strategy. In response, the Soviet Union began supporting communist parties abroad through underground networks, espionage, and propaganda campaigns, tactics that would later define Soviet foreign policy under Stalin. Although Lenin's dream of immediate global revolution failed, The Comintern laid the groundwork for decades of Cold War conflicts and the spread of communism in the 20th century. By 1922, Lenin had won the Civil War, crushed his enemies, and laid the foundation for a communist state. But even as his power reached its peak, his own body was failing him. Years of stress, assassination attempts, and illness had taken their toll. In May 1922, he suffered his first stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed. Over the next 2 years, his health deteriorated rapidly. As Lenin weakened, a new figure was rising. A man who had been quietly maneuvering behind the scenes, building alliances, and consolidating power within the Communist Party. His name was Joseph Stalin, and unlike Lenin, Stalin had no interest in global revolution. His ambitions were different. His rise would change the course of Soviet history forever. Vladimir Lenin, the man who had led the Bolsheviks to power, orchestrated the Russian Revolution, and built the world's first communist state, died in the year 1924. His passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of an internal power struggle that would reshape the Soviet Union and the course of world history. But Lenin's death was anything but straightforward. For years, historians and medical experts have debated the cause. Was it the natural decline of an overworked leader, or was something more sinister at play? And then came the biggest question of all. What would happen now? With Lenin gone, who would lead the Soviet Union? The answer to that question would determine the fate of millions. Lenin's health had been deteriorating since May 1922, when he suffered the first of 3 strokes. The initial attack left him with difficulty speaking and partial paralysis. Despite treatment, he never fully recovered. Over the next 2 years, his condition worsened. By March 1923, after a third and more severe stroke, he could no longer speak at all. He was completely incapacitated. For months, he remained isolated, unable to lead, unable to resist the shifting political tides within the Communist Party. Then, on January 21, 1924, at the age of 53, Lenin died. The official cause of death was listed as a massive stroke, but suspicions arose immediately. Lenin had complained of violent headaches, insomnia, and seizures in the months leading up to his death. His mental clarity faded in and out. Some of his symptoms resembled arsenic or lead poisoning, a theory that has lingered for decades. But who would have poisoned him, and why? One theory points to Stalin. By the early 1920s, Stalin had been steadily consolidating power within the Communist Party. Lenin, in his final years, had grown wary of Stalin, describing him in private notes as too rude and warning that he had too much control. Some historians argue that Stalin saw Lenin's death as the last obstacle in his rise to absolute power. Others suggest that Lenin's health problems were not political but medical. There has been speculation that he suffered from neurosyphilis, a condition that causes similar neurological symptoms. Some of Lenin's contemporaries also noted a possible genetic predisposition. His father had died young from a cerebral hemorrhage. To this day, the exact cause of Lenin's death remains a mystery. The Soviet government never allowed a thorough forensic investigation, and Lenin's preserved body, still on display in Moscow, holds secrets that may never be unlocked. Regardless of the cause, Lenin's passing left behind a vacuum of power, one that was quickly filled by a man far more ruthless than even Lenin himself. Before Lenin's death, there was no clear successor. The Soviet leadership was not structured like a monarchy where power passed automatically to the next in line. Instead, Lenin's death triggered a brutal struggle within the Communist Party, with Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Zinoviev all vying for control. Of all these men, Trotsky was the most famous. As the architect of the Red Army, he had played a critical role in securing Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War. He was seen as the natural heir to Lenin's revolutionary vision. But Stalin had something far more valuable: control over the Communist Party's internal structure. By the time Lenin died, Stalin had spent years quietly maneuvering behind the scenes. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, he had placed his allies in key positions. He controlled party appointments, propaganda, and internal communications. This gave him enormous influence over the government, even though many saw him as a lesser intellectual compared to Trotsky. When Lenin's death was announced, Stalin wasted no time. He took charge of Lenin's funeral arrangements and positioned himself as the rightful heir. Trotsky, who was ill at the time, was conveniently sent misleading information about the funeral date, causing him to miss the ceremony entirely. Stalin then used Lenin's own words, twisting them for his own advantage. He framed himself as Lenin's closest ally and the true guardian of his legacy. Meanwhile, he launched a smear campaign against Trotsky, portraying him as arrogant, disconnected from the working class, and even disloyal to Lenin's vision. By 1927, Stalin had completely outmaneuvered Trotsky, forcing him into exile. Kamenev and Zinoviev, who had initially allied with Stalin, were later eliminated when they became inconvenient. Within a few years, Stalin stood alone at the top. He had transformed Lenin's one-party state into a personal dictatorship. The Soviet Union was no longer a revolutionary experiment. It was now an empire ruled by fear. And Lenin's ideas? They were about to be rewritten. Lenin had once promised a workers' paradise, a state where power rested with the proletariat, where democracy existed within the Communist Party, and where economic planning would eliminate inequality. But by the time of his death, his vision had already begun to fall apart. Lenin had promised peace, yet Russia had endured years of civil war and foreign intervention. He had promised democracy, yet opposition had been silenced through mass executions and political purges. He had promised prosperity, yet famine and economic collapse had left millions starving. His successor, Stalin, took these policies to even greater extremes. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a state ruled by purges, forced labor camps, and absolute control. Dissent was met with death. Was this what Lenin had wanted? Some historians argue that Lenin laid the foundation for Stalin's terror, that his creation of the Cheka, the brutal suppression of political enemies, and the violent tactics used during the Civil War all paved the way for Stalin's dictatorship. Lenin, after all, had approved mass executions of political opponents and had little tolerance for dissent within his party. Others, however, argue that Stalin twisted Lenin's vision, that Lenin, while authoritarian, still believed in some form of collective leadership and that Stalin's rule was an extreme distortion of Bolshevism. What is clear is that Lenin's legacy remains deeply controversial. Some view him as a visionary revolutionary, while others see him as the architect of Soviet authoritarianism. What is not in dispute is that his revolution changed the world forever. Lenin died at the age of 53, young for a political leader. Had he lived another decade, would he have prevented Stalin's rise? Would he have found a way to reform the Soviet system before it became a dictatorship? Or would he have ruled with just as much brutality? It is one of history's greatest what-ifs. But Lenin was gone. Stalin was now in power, and the Soviet Union was about to enter its darkest chapter yet. Vladimir Lenin, revolutionary, theorist, leader, a man whose ideas shaped the 20th century, whose revolution toppled an empire, and whose legacy continues to stir debate. But was he a visionary who sought to free the working class, or was he a ruthless dictator who laid the foundation for one of the most oppressive regimes in history? There is no simple answer. Lenin championed the idea of a classless society, yet he ruled with an iron grip, He dismantled centuries of monarchy and aristocracy, yet replaced them with a system where political dissent was met with imprisonment or execution. He promised power to the people, yet real power remained in the hands of a single party, his party. His death left behind a Soviet Union that had already embraced authoritarian rule, where state control, secret police, and political purges became the norm. His ideas inspired revolutions across the world, from China to Cuba, but many of those movements resulted in regimes that embraced dictatorship rather than democracy. So, was Lenin's revolution necessary, or was it a tragic mistake? Some argue that the Russian Empire was on the brink of collapse and that without Lenin's leadership, the country would have fallen into complete anarchy. Others believe that his methods were too extreme, that his disregard for democratic principles created a state even more repressive than the one he overthrew. What do you think? Was Lenin a revolutionary genius or a man who led Russia into decades of suffering? Was his vision ever achievable, or was it doomed from the start? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this documentary intriguing, don't miss our next episode on Stalin's secret purges, where we uncover how Lenin's successor turned the Soviet Union into a state ruled by fear, betrayal, and mass executions. Subscribe and stay tuned. History is far from over.